today is a very specific agenda. So I apologize in advance if you were all hoping to have some kind of thrilling, exciting further insights into the life story of William Shakespeare, because today we are specifically talking about the development of his language, the development of his verse and then prose, and then what he began to do with those forms of expression. We just need a little bit of context, don't we? Plays were written in verse in the late medieval age. There still exist copies of plays that were known as the mystery plays that tended to be religious in content. They tended to be performed either at Easter time or Christmas time, the big church festivals. What's absolutely fascinating, though, about mystery plays, we all assume when we hear that term that they're plays about God's mystery or about the mystery of Jesus and the cross and the ascension and so on. Then you discover that at that time, in order to become a craftsman, to become a carpenter, to become a metalworker, to become a blacksmith, and so on, you had to be an apprentice, and as an apprentice, you were studying the mystery of that particular area of work. And then if you were accepted from your apprenticeship, then you had entered the mystery. So it's exactly like a trades union. The mystery was a union, and once you were in, you were part of the mystery, and therefore those medieval plays that were performed by, this is the shepherd's play and this is the carpenter's play, and so they were performed by people who were saying, this is our union, this is our trades union that is performing to you. So just a little bit of evidence of how we can be amazed by what actually happened with the beginnings of drama. I guess the people who were preparing scripts, and some of them, as I say, are extant, of mystery plays, were aware that plays happened in Greece, ancient Greece, and then plays happened in Rome, Roman plays, and that they were written in verse. So a play is something that is written in verse because it goes all the way back to the classics. So if we are going to do a play, it's got to have speeches that have rhythm and sometimes rhyme, because that's what plays are. Plays were relatively infrequent, medieval going up to the Tudors, but then there arrived a play called Gorboduc. Gorboduc was written by two men. I think one of them, they were both called Thomas. One was Thomas Norton and one was Thomas Sackville, who wrote Gorboduc. But why am I telling you about Gorboduc? Because it appeared in 1561 and it is the first play in blank verse. That is iambic pentameter lines. Iambic pentameter meaning, as you in America are all familiar with pentagon, and when we're religious, we're familiar with the Pentateuch and so on. Pent means 5, and therefore a pentameter is 5 stresses to a line, and iambic is ba-boom. So an iambic pentameter is ba-boom, 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 ba-boom. That became the necessary method of communication in drama. Plays were written with iambic pentameters. There's evidence that occasionally people set out to write something with an 8-stress line, which I think is called an Alexandrine, and it absolutely doesn't work. I mean, you can try acting those 8-line sentences, and something just isn't quite right about the human thought process. It's very difficult to define, but each time the Alexandrine line just seems to go on a bit or be overextended. There's something about the iambic pentameter that just fits with human communication. It just seems to express how we think, in the phrases that we think, and in the units that we think. But there's probably another reason why blank verse iambic pentameters became the form that then all writers started to use. We're talking about plays that would be performed in the open air, plays that were performed in tavern yards, open spaces, then the original north of the River Thames London theatres, and they were roofless, not ruthless, roofless. And therefore the actors really had to project because they were in the open air and had to reach the audience who were all around, but also way above as well. So breathing for the actors becomes very important, that you can say a blank verse line and have a breath at the end of it, and then that next blank verse line. You're wonderfully able to project your voice when there's just that degree of a teeny breather. I'm talking about early blank verse, and that's what Shakespeare inherited. Christopher Marlowe was known during his own lifetime as the writer of the mighty line. And the mighty line, in Marlowe's case, was pretty much always grandiloquent and very, very much to be projected and to be sonorous and so on. It's pretty hard working on a Marlowe play. Maybe you can achieve it with Edward II, but with something like Tamburlaine, that they are so big, bold, mighty line that they're very, very difficult to make real. So, talking about William Shakespeare, then, we know We were talking just the other day about how he became involved. First of all, he was an actor, and then possibly a bit of a dog's body with a writing team who'd set out to do pre-Tudor history in a project that became known as Henry VI Part 1, Henry VI Part 2, Henry VI Part 3. Shakespeare was involved early on, perhaps just rushing to and fro to look up documents to get historical details and so on. But then Shakespeare begins to contribute more, and I contend, I've said this before to some of you, but you can tell in some of the speeches of Queen Margaret in Part 2 that there's a very different, special voice that is coming into the writing of the plays. And I think Shakespeare is beginning to write more, and to the point where one of the men who was writing on this project was probably told, thank you so much for your work so far, but we don't need you anymore. And he was called Robert Greene, and he was, I think probably the Elizabethan phrase is pissed off, because he then wrote a pamphlet scorning this young writer who'd pretty much taken over his position, and therefore in Robert Greene's pamphlet, he says that he's a tiger wrapped in a player's hide who thinks himself the only Shake seen in the country, scorning him, sort of trying to tell other writers, this is a ghastly bloke who's trespassing in our territory. It's evidence that young William Shakespeare was employed, first of all, as an actor, and it's evidence that he had written things in Henry VI Part 2, because a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide is a misquote of a line in Henry VI Part 2, a tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide, which is obviously what Shakespeare had written about Queen Margaret. Shakespeare is beginning his work in the Henry VI plays, and I think is then being taken on board as somebody who can write some of the material himself. And I'm going to prove it to you. Here is King Henry VI, desperate because his troops are in retreat, and he's in retreat, and he's wandered off alone. And he has this extraordinary soliloquy where, in a totally helpless state, he's sitting on what he describes as a molehill, and is talking his thoughts out loud. And after a while, with this soliloquy, he begins to fantasize about a different kind of life. Oh God, methinks it were a happy life, to be no better than a homely swain, to sit upon a hill as I do now, to carve out dials quaintly, point by point, thereby to see the minutes, how they run, how many make the hour full complete, how many hours bring about the day? How many days will finish up the year? How many years a mortal man may live? When this is known, then to divide the times. So many hours must I tend my flock. So many hours must I take my rest. So many hours must I contemplate. So many hours must I sport myself. So many days my ewes have been with young. So many weeks ere the poor fools will eat. So many years ere I shall shear the fleece. So many hours, days, months, and years passed over to the end they were created would bring white hairs unto a quiet grave. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary soliloquy of a pastoral lifetime. And I believe it's absolute evidence that the writer is William Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon, who knew everything about the country life, every detail of what it was like to be a shepherd. He probably, during his youth, helped look after sheep at various times. So I think this is our young William. But why I was reading it out in that way is because it perfectly demonstrates that for the playwright, the given language was the iambic pentameter. Da-da, 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 da-da. To carve out dials quaintly point by point, thereby to see the minutes how they run, how many make the hour full complete, how many hours bring about the day. I mean, that speech is perfect iambic pentameter. And it's Shakespeare saying, okay, if this is the given form, I understand this is how plays have to be written, this is what we're all doing, this is the vocabulary, this is the style, then I can use it so that the rhythm makes us feel like time is passing, like we are counting the seconds, we are counting the minutes. And by the end of that speech, we've arrived at a quiet grave. The rhythm is terribly important to the meaning of the speech. So it's Shakespeare agreeing, okay, we write in iambic pentameters, and I'm really going to use it as part of the meaning. Okay, so then obviously, Shakespeare's employers realized that they'd got somebody who was tremendously talented and could carry on the Henry VI project into Richard III and so on. But I think there were early commissions as well. Okay, this guy can really write. He's very smart. Well, there was a play. It should have been very funny, but it didn't quite work. Some other company did it. What's it called? The Taming of a Shrew. William, could you have another go at this play? Could you do a rewrite? Could you make it so much more exciting? Make it funnier? I can tell you this with absolute certainty because there still exists a script of a play called The Taming of a Shrew, written several years before William's version. And William's version, The Taming of the Shrew, is based on the storyline, but completely transforms that project with the use of language. So, Shakespeare has got the task of bringing fortune-seeking, boisterous, loudmouthed Petruchio into a scene with Catherine, Kate, and her reputation is that no wooers will go anywhere near her because she's so temperamental, she's so angry, she just destroys any possibility of any relationship with the wooers. So Shakespeare needs to create these two. Petruchio begins trying to be well-mannered, and after introducing himself and celebrating her name, Kate, he says, "Myself am moved to woo thee for my wife." And she says, "Moved in good time. Let him that moved you hither remove you hence. I knew you at the first, you were a movable." "Why, what's a movable?" "A joint stool." "Thou'st hit it. Come, sit on me." "Asses are made to bear, and so are you." "Women are made to bear, and so are you." "No such jade as you, if me you mean." "Alas, good Kate, I will not burden thee, for knowing thee to be but young and light, too light for such a swain as you to catch, and yet as heavy as my weight should be, should buzz, well ta'en and like a buzzard. Oh, slow-winged turtle, shall a buzzard take thee?" Okay, that's the to and fro between Kate and Petruchio. I took it down to those last two lines because should be, should buzz, well ta'en and like a buzzard is an iambic pentameter. It's a shared line. Should be, should buzz, well ta'en and like a buzzard, right? That's an iambic pentameter. But the first half is Kate and the second half is Petruchio, yes? Sorry, first half is Petruchio. Should be, should buzz, well ta'en and like a buzzard. So Shakespeare is saying you can have iambic pentameters, but you can split them halfway through. So he's inventing the shared line. And then, just over the page, she's saying, "If I be waspish, best beware my sting. My remedy then is to pluck it out. Aye, if the fool could find it where it lies, who knows not where a wasp does wear his sting? In his tail, in his tongue, whose tongue? Yours, if you talk of tails, and so farewell." He's now divided the pentameter 3 times, right? I, if the fool could find it where it lies, is a pentameter. Who knows not where a wasp does wear his sting? Pentameter. In his tail, in his tongue, whose tongue is a pentameter. But she's speaking it, he's joining in, she's speaking it. He's dividing a pentameter 3 times. Ooh, this young writer has got a certain mischief and a way of breaking the rules or making the rules new. And then, whose tongue? Yours, if you talk of tails, and so farewell. What? With my tongue in your tail? Nay, come again. A really wicked, naughty sexual joke at the end of their verbal conflict. He continues it in constant shared lines then. It is my fashion when I see a crab, why, here's no crab, and therefore look not sour. There is, then show it me, had I a glass I would, what mean you mean my face, well aimed of such a young one now. By St. George, I am too young for you, yet you are withered, 'tis with cares I care not. Look, they're all split up. That's both Kate and Petruchio talking, and again, he's splitting the pentameter 3 ways. And consequently, the impact of being able to split the pentameter three ways in that roguish way, and of course it goes on and on and on through the play, as well as Shakespeare beginning to explore prose in the play as well. What Shakespeare is doing by breaking up the pentameter line is making things more recognizably naturalistic, more recognizably truthful, less dominated by da-da, 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 break it up. I'm still obeying the rules, but I'm breaking the rules at the same time. Okay, so this wonderful, I was mentioning verse and prose, and Elizabethan prose, particularly when you read Elizabethan prose in documentation, like Francis Bacon and so on. I mean, it's pretty difficult stuff. Sentences very, very, very long, and clauses within sentences and so on. So in many ways, it's understandable that as the theatre was taking off as the new fad in London, writers decided to go for it in verse rather than prose. But very early on in Shakespeare's career, I think this is Shakespeare too, in the Henry Sixes, the play deals with a rebellion led by it's a kind of peasant rebellion led by a guy called Jack Cade. And Cade speaks in prose each time. Cade is talking in prose exactly the same as people in the Groundlings audience would be speaking. And then Cade, in order to escape, arrives in the garden of a nobleman called Iden. And again, can't finally be proved, but I think this is Shakespeare's contribution in the Henry Sixes. Iden speaks in verse and Cade speaks in prose in the same scene. Every time Iden speaks, it's in iambic pentameters, and when Cade answers him, it's in prose. I think that thing that Shakespeare is saying of, okay, nobleman and peasant, that's where our two potential languages come from. But I mentioned the word naturalistic, didn't I? And I probably use it too much in my account of Shakespeare's development, but I think again and again he's observing the rules but wanting to make character and expression more truthful so that it can be more emotional, so that there can be more emotional contact with the audience, so that it's not language to be projected, it's language, as Hamlet later on says, speak the speech I pray you as I pronounced it to you drippingly on the tongue. Don't mouth it. Come on, make it real. Is what Shakespeare is going after, even as early as areas of the Henry Sixes. But he became very fascinated with writing history plays, or his management became fascinated with his history plays because they did very well with audiences. So come on, William, write another one. He writes Richard II, and once again, as with that Henry VI speech that I was quoting, once again, it's a king in a desperate state, a king understanding that monarchy is virtually meaningless, and once again, Shakespeare chooses to do it in blank verse, iambic pentameters. And Richard says, for God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits, scoffing his state and grinning at his pomp, allowing him a breath, a little scene, to monarchize, to be feared and killed with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which wars about our life were brass impregnable, and humoured thus, comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king. That's Shakespeare naturalizing iambic pentameters. I mean, I was reading that, observing the pentameter, observing the line ending, but that's a wonderfully truthful speech of how we're led to believe that we can be impregnable and inviolate, and then along comes a situation, and then bye. The actor can play that completely emotionally. The actor can play that almost in tears, as the actor is realizing, there was I, ever since my childhood, told to believe that I was king, and it's meaningless. It's gone. Shakespeare chooses so carefully the situations where in soliloquy he can increase the naturalism of the blank verse line. So frequently that involves something we call not having an end stop. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. But in Shakespeare's folio text, there's no punctuation. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, is what he's written. So the end stop, let us sit upon the ground, pause, and tell sad stories of the death of kings. But he's saying, no, you don't need that. You can keep going. So again and again, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered, pause. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. That's two lines of text, but it's half an iambic pentameter, an iambic pentameter, and another half of an iambic pentameter, all in a thought with no punctuation at the end of the lines. Shakespeare is saying we can naturalize this language, and continues to do so. If anyone was here a couple of days ago, we were talking about Shakespeare being hugely influenced by autobiographical things, for example, being the father of twins, and therefore very early on in his writing career, He writes the Comedy of Errors because he has twins, Judith and Hamlet, and they're crazy little kids, and they play games with him and run around the house, and oh God, they keep swapping clothes and getting us terribly confused about which is, I mean, I'm sure all of that kind of stuff went on. So Shakespeare celebrates that in a play called The Comedy of Errors, and he makes it two sets of twins. Two young noblemen and two servants, twins and twins, and therefore wonderful farcical mess-ups. But then his little boy, Hamlet, aged 11, dies as an effect of the plague, shattering, absolutely shattering. And Shakespeare has now got tragedy in his life. And quite soon after that, he writes a play, another play, about twins called Twelfth Night. But this time, it's not a jokey, farcical play about twins. It's a play about a shipwreck where one twin arrives on shore and believes that her twin brother is dead. How is she going to survive? The only way I can survive is I have to dress as a boy, as a young man, as a youth, because otherwise any ghastly sexual abuse can happen to me if I'm a girl alone in a foreign country. I've got to become a young man. But of course, there's another ingredient. If I become a young man, I become my brother. And by becoming my brother, I can somehow keep him alive. And consequently, when at the end of the play, he discovers, they are alive. The play is overwhelmingly emotional. I mean, we're in floods of tears that a miracle has happened. They're both alive after all. And Shakespeare, of course, writes it very emotionally because he's invested in it, because how wonderful would it be if my daughter Judith and my little boy Hamlet could meet together and both be alive. Well, at least I can feel that in a play. So it's a different kind of truthfulness. And therefore, a soliloquy, as with Viola in Twelfth Night. I mean, the famous soliloquy. I left no ring with her. What means this lady? Fortune forbid my outside have not charmed her. And then she said, oh my God, I think it's true. Oh, wow. This is terrible. I've dressed as a boy and she thinks that I'm a young man and she's now coming on to me, right? Okay. As the speech develops, my master loves her dearly, and I, poor monster, fond as much on him, and she, mistaken, seems to dote on me. What will become of this? As I am a man, my state is desperate for my master's love. As I am a woman, now, alas the day, what thriftless sigh shall poor Olivia breathe? Oh, time, thou must untangle this, not I. It's too hard a knot for me to untie. Completely naturalistic use of the iambic pentameter. Again and again, no end stop, punctuation in the middle of the line, But what he's also using is something that Shakespeare absolutely adores. He continues to use it long into his writing career as his skill becomes more extraordinary. The whole idea of antithesis. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that. Or double antithesis. There is this and this, and sometimes that and that. Antithesis. And here in this speech, he's beginning to explore antithesis. My master loves her dearly, and I, poor monster, fond as much on him, and she, mistaken, seems to dote on me. As I am a man, my state is desperate for my master's love. As I am a woman, alas the day, he's loving balancing this antithetical notion, and those antitheses crop up in many major situations. But of course, as he is continuing to mourn the idea of twins and to mourn the death of his son Hamnet, it's no accident that he writes a play about a student. I say that with passionate emphasis once more, a student called Hamlet. Hamlet is a university student. So all the many productions you've seen where he's played by a brilliant 35-year-old actor is not what William Shakespeare is at. He's a student. Hamlet is 20. He's coming back from university and planning to return to university. Horatio, his fellow student, Laertes is just going off to university in that scene with Polonius. Ophelia is probably only 16. I mean, they're kids. So Shakespeare is investing himself, his personal life, his personal dreams in a play called Hamlet. Wouldn't it be wonderful to imagine my boy being brilliantly articulate and brilliantly skilled with language and so on. So, of course, we get the most famous speech in all literature. But I just want to point out, even though it is famous, we do have to understand that Shakespeare is very precisely dramatizing a student who studies philosophy. Hamlet says to Horatio, there are more things than are dreamt of in our philosophy. They're fellow students and they study philosophy. Yes? A philosophy student who a bit later on in the play says, my tables, meet it is, I set it down. What were tables? Tables was a kind of notebook situation for students to make a note and remember later. I mean, Shakespeare is very, very clear that Hamlet is a student. And so a student is saying, a philosophy student is saying, to be or not to be. That is the question. That's the exam question. That's the question we are to debate today. Yes? That's a philosophy student saying that is the question. I'm now going to expand on it a little bit. So the question is whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. How can I summarize? To die, to sleep. by sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. The consummation devoutly to be wished, to die to sleep perchance to dream. There's the rub. I mean, I'm being a philosophy student who is working through a project. And the project is, what are the pros and cons? What are the antitheses when you are debating to go on living your life, however horrible it is, or to make an end of your own life in order to get rid of it? But if you're a philosophy student, you have to face up to the fact that if you end your life to get rid of it, you might be entering something that is 10 times worse, because you don't know. Philosophy student. Of course, the speech has become world famous with actors suggesting, like Laurence Olivier, that he might hurl himself off the battlements of the castle and kill himself at that very moment. But I don't think that's what Shakespeare is writing. Shakespeare is saying we need to debate this. What are the different pros and cons? And just to talk a little bit more about how he's developing his language, just consider, who would fardels bear to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. That's one sentence. That's one continuous thought. 6 verse lines. I mean, the way that Shakespeare is saying this verse language doesn't have to be any restriction on how real we can be. He's a genius because you can read that speech differently, to grunt and sweat under a weary life, but that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns, puzzles the will. I mean, they're all iambic pentameters, but we got to get beyond that. Yes? Okay. So it's no surprise that Shakespeare then is going to go much, much further when, having had that experience with Kate and Petruchio, having had a wonderful set of exchanges between Beatrice and Benedick, although that play is largely in prose, that Shakespeare writing how he can, I mean, there are important sequences in verse, but so frequently Beatrice and Benedick are exchanging wit in prose, and Shakespeare is beginning to love that. But here we are. Sorry, we're in a theatre. Am I allowed to say the word out loud? The Macbeth play?
Your call.
You're okay? You're not as superstitious as I am? All right. Well, in Macbeth, it's the moment of the murder. They've been talking about it. The witches have prophesied that Macbeth is going to be king. The only way it's going to happen is to get rid of the current king. And that's what the witches are saying you've got to do. Lady Macbeth is alone, hushed. Alack, I'm afraid they have awaked, and 'tis not done. The attempt and not the deed confounds us. Hark! laid the daggers ready. He could not miss them. Had he not resembled my father as he slept, I had done it. Macbeth enters. My husband, I've done the deed. Didst thou not hear a noise? I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry. Did not you speak? When? Now, as I descended, I, hark! Who lies at the second chamber? Donalbain. That sequence begins. Lady Macbeth is speaking iambic pentameters. Alack, I am afraid they have awaked, and 'tis not done the attempt and not the deed. Confounds us, hark, I laid their daggers ready. I didn't read it anywhere like iambic pentameters because the punctuation is all in the middle of the lines and one thought finishing and then another thought replacing it and no punctuation at the ends of the lines. But then, when Macbeth appears, I've done the deed, didst thou not hear a noise? Iambic pentameter. I heard the owl scream and the crickets cry, iambic pentameter. Did not you speak when now as I descended is a pentameter. Did not you speak when now as I descended is one line. Split 4 ways between Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth. I, hark, who lies at the second chamber. Donalbain, this is a sorry sight. Again, pentameters, but cut and mixed up 3 ways. Shakespeare is saying, in the most incredibly dramatic situations, I can keep it as a pentameter and I can make you believe it's totally real speech. It's real speech that, if you believe as I do, when that play was first performed, it was performed at the Inns of Court in a room, probably with an audience a little bit bigger than you, but in the midst of an audience, it was candlelit. So when Banquo says, their candles are all out, candles. I think Shakespeare knows that this play is phenomenally naturalistic and so frequently needs to be whispered and hushed. And he wrote it for a small theatre space. And then, gradually it became popular and therefore, all right, well, we can do it big and in the globe if you like, but it's not how I wrote it. So there you've got pentameters becoming completely and totally naturalistic dialogue. Shakespeare becoming more and more intrigued with those possibilities and crossing over with prose. So the other thing I'm sure I can be corrected on this by my great historian friend, but something obviously occurs in Shakespeare's life where he, having written a large number of comedies, is then writing Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, Antony Cleopatra, Coriolanus, tragedy after tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. Occasional little snippets of humor within those plays, but for the most part, tragedy. It's become how he needs to express himself. And of course, although it was written in the middle of that group, the most ultimate of all tragedies is King Lear. A king in possession of everything and asking his daughters how much they love him, and Cordelia, what have you got to say? Nothing. Nothing. Nothing will come of nothing. I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary use of pentameter verse, but he banishes her. He then believes his other two daughters don't love him after all, and therefore rushes out into the storm and then goes through this incredible process of going from king to somebody who's understanding everything about the human condition that he's never, ever, ever understood before, and is accompanied by Gloucester, who's also going through the same nightmare, extraordinary set of revelations, and then these two old men at the end of the play, an 80-year-old and a man ever so slightly younger, are talking about life in a way that they now understand and never, ever, ever did when they were in power and when they were in authority. It's an incredible journey that Shakespeare writes from king all the way through to human being. A lot of Lear's revelations are in prose. So a king who begins speaking verse, the great authoritarian king, speaking strong, measured verse. There he is, in the middle of a storm, and they're meeting. He doesn't know that it's a young nobleman in disguise. He's meeting this beggar who has only a loincloth and paint over his body and his hair in weird shapes. He's meeting this beggar, a king on a heath in a storm is meeting a beggar. And in prose, he says, the king says, "Why, thou wert better in thy grave than to answer with thy uncovered body this extremity of the skies. Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Here's three of us are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more, but such a poor, bare, forked animal." Off, you lendings, come, unbutton here. That's the king taking all his clothes off because he's got to become exactly the same as the beggar, but in prose, and that's completely naturalistic prose. I mean, that's not prose that is only half a step away from verse. That is absolutely, totally naturalistic prose. He then arrives at man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal. One of the most devastating things that any dramatist has ever written about the human condition. That's who we are. That amazing language achievement goes on and on in Lear until at the climax, Lear writes what I personally think is the most devastatingly moving iambic pentameter ever. Lear has been reunited with his daughter. They're going to live in a prison cage and they're going to have each other and everything is going to be fine. And then Cordelia is attacked and murdered and Lear brings her dead body out to everybody and nothing has meaning anymore. I do believe, since people have just prayed to the gods that Cordelia will be safe and then the dead body is brought out, that Shakespeare is at the point of saying, I don't know, I'm not sure there's anything up there. The most heinous, ghastly thing has happened. Cordelia is dead. And Lear, over the body, says, I'm never going to be able to talk to you again. And then comes this greatest of all pentameters. Never, 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 never. One single line, written by William Shakespeare. Never, 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 never. It's just so total. The play that began with that argument about nothing and nothing will come of nothing, and then right at the end of it, you've got never, 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 never. I think Shakespeare knows that by then there's not a dry eye in the house. Wonderful use of language. Just before we finish, I've got to then say there was one further phase to Shakespeare's life. Something happened. Something gave Shakespeare some kind of hope where previously he'd given up hope of tragedy after tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And then we come to what we know as the late plays. Pericles, I've said this before in this room, but I've done the play, and I personally believe that although it was included eventually in the third folio, I think Shakespeare wrote very, very little of it. I think probably only about 20% of the play Pericles is by William Shakespeare. But the late plays, The Winter's Tale, Cymbeline, The Tempest, plays about how it's possible that your experience of life, your experience that somehow life hasn't worked for you, can be redeemed by your children, your next generation, belief in the future, the children can give you hope, can make sense of it all, and consequently, the late plays have optimism, they have faith, they have belief, they have, it can all be worthwhile. But Shakespeare, in these late plays, goes one stage further with his verse line. I'm going to give you an example of naturalistic verse. Leontes. Have you not seen, Camillo? But that's past doubt you have, where your eyeglass is thicker than a cuckold's horn, or heard, for to a vision so apparent rumour cannot be mute, or thought, for cogitation resides not in that man that does not think. My wife is slippery, if thou wilt confess, or else be impudently negative, to have nor eyes nor ears nor thought, then say, my wife's a hobby horse, deserves a name as rank as any flax wench that puts to it before her troth plight. Say it and justify it. You would swear that's prose, wouldn't you? You would swear that is just a man interrupting himself for the second time, totally naturalistic, but it's verse. But that's passed out you have, or your eyeglass is thicker than a cuckold's horn or herd, for to a vision so apparent rumour cannot be mute or thought for cogitation. I mean, how is Shakespeare managing it? How can he do language that is so real, so dramatic, so devastating, and yet it's still observing the 5 stresses to a line rule? Beyond, 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 beyond. So there's no explanation. I keep asking these questions, and the only answer is it happens if you're a genius, and there is no explanation for genius. But Shakespeare does end the whole business with pentameters. Some of you may have heard me say this before. Shakespeare was an actor in the Globe Theatre Company. He's listed as an actor. I personally believe that he played the chorus in Henry V. I personally believe that he played Jaques in As You Like It, where all the language of Jaques is about theatre and indeed, when the lovers appear, Orlando speaks, and Jaques says, nay, and thou speak in blank verse, I'm going. I think that's Shakespeare getting the biggest laugh of the whole performance. But I think it's also possible that Shakespeare knew he couldn't keep up with the London life. He wasn't particularly well. He was retiring. He was going back to Stratford. The Tempest is his last play. It's his farewell. A magician who has been able to summon any number of spirits on his island and to be able to manipulate lives of all of the people who arrive on his island is then saying, no, I've got to finish all of this, and so I'm going to break my staff and I'm going to drown my book. And all my ability to manipulate other people has gone, and now I'm leaving. I'm going home. I'm going home to where I came from. I think Shakespeare played Prospero. I think he wrote the part for himself. He's saying, yes, I've been in control of this island for all this time, but I've got to go. And therefore, I think Shakespeare provided for himself an epilogue. There's virtually no other epilogue. There's a Rosalind epilogue at the end of As You Like It, a briefer epilogue, which is just saying, I hope you liked the play, but not in any other way, an epilogue. But The Tempest has an epilogue. And if you imagine that Prospero was played by William Shakespeare, then the actors have all left the stage. And William Shakespeare, playing Prospero, says, now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now, 'tis true, I must be here confined by you or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. Well, I hope I convinced you, because yes, he went back to Stratford-upon-Avon. He was very unwell, and just a few years later, he died, having left the whole of that London scene behind. So it's not that impossible that my unprovable theory is right. Plus, of course, I should add that I do have the odd phone call with William every now and again, especially like when I did the Comedy of Errors as a musical. I phoned him and said, "Is that okay with you?" And he said, "Absolutely, terrific, terrific. That should go gangbusters," he said.
Sometimes Shakespeare veers away from iambic pentameter, and sometimes the meter's irregular. In Twelfth Night, sometimes we have lines with 12 syllables, lines are short by 4 syllables, or sometimes we have shared lines that are that don't add up to 10 syllables. I'm wondering if you can speak more about irregularities in the verse.
You're absolutely accurate, and I think it's at a point where Shakespeare is saying, I don't have to be governed by those rules anymore. If it works better that it's a slightly short line, I'm going to go for that. And if it works better that there's an extra syllable, that's absolutely. And I'm going to mix up verse and prose in Twelfth Night, and I'm going to use songs, and so I think it's Shakespeare. Always at the point of saying, why do we have to be governed by there is only one way of doing something? I think those examples that you were just mentioning, they're not, oops, he screwed up there. He didn't write a proper pentameter there. He's just saying, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And I'm writing disguised pentameters, so I don't think anyone in the audience is going to know. Maybe my mate Ben Johnson will know.
I just wanted to know how many iambic pentameters have double meanings in them?
Ooh. Oh my gosh. Well, all I can tell you is a heck of a lot. Yes. Shakespeare loves the double meaning. He loves the pun. He loves creating innuendo, doesn't he? But off the cuff, I can't tell you how many double meanings. I mean, he also features double meanings in sonnets too, doesn't he? I think probably from quite early in the writing career, he's aware that some words can mean two different things. I mean, it's extraordinary, isn't it, that we've been doing these sessions, and so far I haven't once mentioned the word Falstaff. And Falstaff, when you put Henry IV Part 1 and Henry IV Part 2 together, Falstaff is the biggest part in the whole of the Shakespeare canon. And Falstaff is doing all of those things, of words with double meanings and of messing about with prose and then setting up a play. Hey, come on, let's do a play. I'll play your dad and you play yourself, your dad being King Henry, and you, Hal, can play yourself. And so we're in a pub and we can put a couple of chairs on top of a couple of tables, and I'll become the king and you become you. And then, oh, okay, well, that was fine. Now let's swap. I'll be you and you be your dad. Play within a play. Falstaff doing absolutely outrageous things. And of course, they're speaking in blank verse as they are king and prince. And then back to Falstaff speaking his terrible street language. I mean, he's a noble, he's Sir John Falstaff, but he uses so many slang phrases and thinks it's a great idea to go out with some mates from the cheap East End of London, Boar's Head, to do a robbery, a Knight of the Realm. I mean, it's a fabulous, fabulous creation by Shakespeare. It's the greatest comic character ever. And there you go. We haven't mentioned Falstaff. Falstaff mainly in prose, and Falstaff naughtily doing double meanings. But how many, I can't answer. Boom. So sorry.
So we've been speaking about Shakespeare's use of language and meter and his choices to break those rules or not. But in a discussion of Shakespeare and language, we haven't talked about him also being known for inventing new words and phrases at an unbelievable rate. And I wonder if you can speak on what you think might have been happening at that time that was not only pushing him to break the rules of meter in the instances you described, but also what was pushing him to have so many innovations in
Absolutely.
the language itself.
No, I get you, and I wish I was more expert in the detail of this. There is a wonderful book, but I can't remember who's written it. A wonderful book collecting all the Shakespeare phrases that are in common parlance in 20th and 21st century speech that actually weren't in the language until Shakespeare invented them. I mean, he did it again and again and again. He used little slangy phrases and references that have just come down to us in our language, and we don't understand that as we are chatting away in our daily lives, every now and again we might be using a phrase that was invented by Shakespeare. We don't understand that. There is a book that does list them up, and I'm not sufficiently encyclopedic to be able to tell you how many, or indeed even to particularize. But Greg, I'm sure, will be able to track down that book and then get it in the library. And you can all take turns in taking it out, learning some of the phrases and insulting each other every single day with Shakespeare slang. Sorry, I can't do better than that. Well, how about this is a way to finish. If you declare it's Greek to me, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you claim to be more sinned against than sinning, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you act more in sorrow than in anger, or if you wish, your wish is father to your thought. If your lost property has vanished into thin air, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you've ever refused to budge an inch, or suffered from green-eyed jealousy, if you have played fast and loose, if you have been tongue-tied, if you are a tower of strength, if you have been hoodwinked, or if you are in a pickle, if you have knitted your brows, or made a virtue of necessity, or insisted on fair play, or slept not one wink, or stood on ceremony, or danced attendance. I mean, look, this goes on for another 3 paragraphs. I mean, it's devastating, isn't it? It's absolutely devastating that somebody has gone through all of that and tracked down where each one of those Shakespeare references are from, and they're now part of our language. Absolutely extraordinary.